So I want to start by telling you a very, very, very old story. This is a story about a man who had two lovers. One considerably younger than he, and another that was considerably older than he. Now, when he was with his younger lover and they were cuddling and snuggling, and maybe he was resting her head in his head in her lap, and she was stroking his head, she loved him for his age and his wisdom. And so she would sit there and she would literally pluck the dark hairs out of his head as they were snuggling. However, when he was with his older lover, and she loved him for his youth and his vigor, and as they would snuggle, she would caress his head and pull the white and graying hairs out of his head. And this continued until he was plucked bald. This is a parable. This is actually what we call a rabbinic parable from the first century. It's a parable that most likely Jesus listened to as a boy growing up in the synagogue. It was a parable that was teaching about a debate that was going on in the first century synagogue, and it was a debate over teaching methods. What does religious education look like, as it were? Parables are a part of what is called in Jewish literature the Haggadah. Forgive my bad Hebrew. And you might ask, well, what is Haggadah? Well, technically, I'm told, Haggadah is anything that's not halakha. And then, of course, you're begging the question, what's halakha? Well, you and I today, we would say halakha is the deep Bible exposition. This is where we get in deep. And here's what the debate is that was going on in the first century, is there was the Haggadah teachers, they were teaching to the masses, if you will, to the common folk. And so the Haggadah teaching, of which parables are a part, it appeals to our heart, our emotions. The halakha, these were the thinkers, these were the theologians, and they wanted it deep. And the halakha teachers were saying, we don't need this fluff. This is all a bunch of fluff and nonsense. The Haggadah people are saying, speak to our felt needs. We need to know what this means to us today. And we don't care about all of this deep thinking. And what the wise rabbis were teaching with this somewhat graphic and silly story of the man with two lovers is, you need all your hair. We need it both. And Jesus came along and took this style of teaching to a whole nother level. You know, I used to think that Jesus invented parables. It's not true. So again, Jesus grew up under the rabbinic model, and the rabbis were teaching through parable, through the Haggadah. But Jesus took it to another level, as we know. And today, we have literally hundreds of books that are written about Jesus' amazing educational style and methods. And as we think today, as educators about, okay, what does authentic Christian education need to look like? Well, you got to look at what Jesus did. And it's absolutely amazing. And we have to look at the parables because, you know, 1/3 of the recorded words of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels are all in parable form. In fact, it's been said that if we want to know Jesus and we want to know how he taught, what he believed in, and who Jesus is, we must know the parables. But to know the parables, we've got some work to do because we're separated from these by time, by culture, by language. It's been said that to truly know the parables and to know what they mean, it's discovered in the first century synagogue, not the 21st century church. So we got some work to do, but as we study the parables and as we study the teaching method that was designed for the parables, we begin to see how Jesus used this teaching method in amazing ways to impact his culture and impact us to today. See, parables, they were the most popular form of almost entertainment, if you will, of the day, at least on a common level. Parables were so popular, it was almost like these things. You know, they're endemic to our society now, right? We can't get away from these things. Well, actually, that was the level of popularity of parables, to the point that if you were walking down the street and somebody stood up and said, a parable, that was kind of like announcing they're going to tell a new parable, literally people would stop doing business. And remember the old TV commercial about E.F. Hutton? Yeah, that's the over 50 crowd that's saying, yes, I remember, right? So there was this old TV commercial, kids, right, and that was a financial counselor, right? And it was like when E.F. Hutton speaks, and everybody stops and listens. Well, that was true in the first century. Somebody who wanted to present a parable, and so kids would practice telling parables. Parents and guys at work, I mean, this was just, but the rabbis, the really powerful and popular rabbis, these were the great parable speakers. Why did Jesus gather such a huge following? Yes, the miracles, but primarily, and read it, it's in the text, because of his unique teaching. This guy told parables like nobody's told them before, because he got the Haggadah and he brought the Halakha with it. The depth of understanding, of knowledge, of insight that came through his teaching. Wow. So today, as we look to craft and shape, what does the academy look like? What does Christian education look like that's authentically Christian, reflects what Jesus did? I want to make very quickly 5 observations about the values of Christian education that Jesus brought to us and that are born out of his use of the parabolic method and his form of teaching. Number 1, Jesus taught to specific students. Today in education speak, we would call this the value of differentiated instruction or differentiation. The point is this: Jesus was speaking to a specific people in a specific culture, in a specific time and place, in a specific way. In other words, he was what we call as educators, he was student-centered. He wasn't curriculum-centered or textbook-centered, he was student-centered. Today, in the lowest forms of education, we're just running kids through a textbook. No. What does the kid need? What's the student need? If the textbook's got something to help that, great. But let's be focused on the student. What does the student need? We differentiate the instruction based on their needs. And that's hard work. Ask any teacher. That's the challenge of the day. But this is what Jesus modeled for us. Here, I'll say something at the first may sound controversial. Is this book written to me? Is the Bible written to me? Is it written to you? No. It was written to specific people in a specific place, in a specific time, in a specific culture, in a specific language. Now, is it for you? Is it for me? Is there much for us to learn and by the Spirit of God transformation in our lives? Yes, absolutely. But what we first have to understand is, what did it mean to the original hearers? What did the author intend? And once we know that, we can then apply it to ourselves. Specific instruction for specific people in a specific way. That's differentiated instruction. And Jesus was doing it 2,000 years ago. And it's what we need to be about doing today. Secondly, and perhaps what makes the opportunity of a Christian school so powerful, is a focus on God. What we might call a theocentric teaching. Everything Jesus taught was about God. In Christian education, we have a buzz phrase. We talk about how all truth is God's truth. Amen? Right? This was a Baptist church, right? Amen? All truth is God's truth. That means when we find truth, no matter where we find it, if it's true, it's a reflection of God. Therefore, the opportunity we have in Christian education, it doesn't matter if we're talking about math or science or liberal arts, language arts, performing arts, anytime we encounter truth, we're encountering something we can learn about God. We study the parables. The first thing you must ask when you're trying to understand or interpret a parable is, what is this teaching me about God? Because that's what rabbinic parables are all about. They're about God. That's the whole point. For teachers, we'd say, there's the learning outcome. All right? There's the target learning. Is what are we going to learn about God through this parable? And if you're asking any other question, you're off track. Because this is what parables are about. They're teaching us about God. Well, the same thing is true here in a Christian school setting. We have the opportunity, like no other place on planet Earth, to continually be theocentric in our worldview. Why does it matter? How does this connect us to the world around us and the world that God's created? we can pursue that at a level that cannot be pursued in any other place when it comes to education. Third, Jesus he taught guiding his hearers towards a response. And I would call this the value of student self-discovery. We've learned over now decades of research in education and even in how the brain works that what I am doing right now is the lowest form of education. Passive audience, listening to a speaker. This is called the transmissive approach. Now, if I'm energetic enough and I keep you focused with me, you're going to hang with me for a while. But what I've learned is you're going to forget 93% of what I say this morning by the time you have lunch. I tell you, as an educator, that's pretty depressing. So the form of education that those of you who knew E.F. Hutton was, that we had what we've learned, it's one of the worst forms of education on planet Earth. What we have discovered, however, is what Jesus knew so long ago, is that students learn best and retain the learning through active learning, through self-discovery of the learning. And our job as educators is to guide them in that self-discovery, bring them to a point to make a response. Right now, we know that the attention span of the average person, and this isn't just students, but the average person, is about 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Whoa. Now, I wish you would sit here and be actively listening with me for 90 minutes. As a teacher speaker, that's what I want, but I just know it's not reality. And in our culture, that number is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And we can moan about it. We can say, oh, isn't that awful? Yeah, it is, but it's our reality. So let's figure out how to teach to that culture. That's exactly what Jesus did. He saw, people are connected to parables, then I'm going to use parables. And I'm going to use them at a level that's never been done before. Well, this is our challenge today as educators. We can't be doing education for our kids based on our past, but based on their current reality and into their unknown future. And we have to guide them to discovering the learning, and not just yak, 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 yak. How do we make it active? This is our challenge. Fourth, Jesus was committed to meeting the needs of all learners. Here's the value of all students. In Genesis, we read that God created Adam and Eve, and he declared that they were good. So does that mean when sin came in the world, they became bad? No. That Hebrew word being translated good is actually the word for value. It says God created them with value. Jesus elevated the value of every person when that was not the case or was not true in his culture or his society. And it's certainly, we see it still today, not every person is valued. Today in our pop culture, only the pretty people are valued. Only the smart and the rich and the intellectual are valued. Jesus valued every individual. I think when I was a high school principal, I have to reflect on, we sit in the role of chief disciplinarian of the school. And I very quickly learned that as kids came in who had made bad choices, inappropriate actions or words, but what I learned is there was always something behind it. There's a story to know here. And that even though, yes, they made some bad choices, that didn't lower the value of that student. That individual still had great value. And how do I pour into that and speak to that value? Fifth, Jesus was a master of utilizing his instructional settings. We might call this the value of supportive learning environments. That's fancy education speak. But what I'm talking about is he thought about where he was and the surroundings of where he was in presenting what he was teaching. And again, I don't have time this morning, but we could spend time after time, example after example, read through the Gospels and pay attention to where Jesus is when he's delivering his teaching. What did he talk about when they were out in a shepherd's field? What did he talk about when he's sitting in a boat? What did he talk about when he was standing next to a temple wall? He knew the power of the visual environment. Here at Village, we talk about our commitment to God and our commitment to excellence. Well, part of that commitment to excellence means we need to invest in learning environments that best support the students' learning. And I believe we're doing that here. It's part of what attracted me to join this team, is I see this commitment to excellence. We need to keep pursuing that. We need to unleash our teachers as well, though, to take their kids into other environments. I'm a big fan of field trips. Get them out of here. What we remember is what we experience. So go get some other experiences. Get out of the classroom, right? So here you have it. Kind of 5 observations of major values of what authentic Christian education should look like. Teaching to specific students in a specific way for their specific needs, differentiation. Focus on God constantly. Here's our great opportunity. Every lesson, every interaction, not in a false way, not in let's add the religious stuff on, but no, authentically. What does this teach us about God? And let's process how they see the world correctly. Third, guiding toward a response. Rather than blah, 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 what do you think that means? Where do you think this should go? Asking lots of questions and guiding students so they discover the learning and it goes deep and they retain it. Meeting the needs of everyone. That all students can learn, and I believe this, every student can learn. With enough initiative and enough support, every student can learn. We value them all. And fifth, we value the supportive learning environment. And that's not just physical, that's also emotional. What's our emotional environment look like? Which brings me back to where I started. One of the things I can observe and have already been able to assess of what we're doing well here at Village is this learning environment is phenomenal. Encourage one another day after day. That's what I see at VCA. I've experienced it myself personally like no other campus I've been on, and I mean that. This is the work we need to be about, and here's our application for all of us, because we're not just talking about Christian education this morning, we're talking about life. The writer of Hebrews wasn't talking to Christian school administrators. He was talking to all of us, saying, what should mark our characteristics of who we are as followers of Jesus? We should be encouragers. This is what should mark what we do all day long, every day, intentionally. Well, how frequently do we have to be doing this? Day after day, so long as it's called today. And I think that's actually a little comical, right? Because if we talk about what was yesterday called when it was today? Today. What's today called? Today. When we get to tomorrow, what's it going to be called? Today. Yeah, so what's he saying? He's saying, don't stop this. Reflect with me for a moment. Who have you intentionally encouraged in the last 24 hours? When others think of you, when others think of me, is what comes to their mind, oh, he or she they're an encourager. You know the power of encouragement? It's huge. Reflect on those voices, those individuals who have had the greatest impact and influence in your life to this point. Think about what kind of characteristic that person possesses. I'm almost going to guarantee you they're an encourager. Does that mark how we're walking through life? It's how I want to be remembered. It's how I want to walk through life, whether that's with my peers or that's with students or teachers or my family or my child. Encourage each other as long as it's called today. Why? Because it keeps us in alignment with Jesus. It keeps us in alignment with the truth of who he is and what he has done. You know, the work of the ministry of the body of Christ is not saving the world. Jesus does that. Jesus said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He's going to get it done. It doesn't depend on us. What we have the opportunity to do is to participate with him to reflect that good news by encouraging everyone that he brings along in our path. And so my challenge to myself this morning And my challenge to all of us is our life, is our walk marked by being an encourager? That we're doing this day to day and every day, and we're doing it intentionally.